And then, with a single phrase from the judge, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't the kind of polite acknowledgement one hears in hushed legal chambers. It was raw, uncontainable, a surge of human energy that shattered the silence like thunder breaking over a storm. For a moment, the centuries-old solemnity of the courtroom gave way to something rare: celebration. A judge, usually cloaked in the neutral language of law, had pierced through with words that carried weight far beyond the case at hand. But how did we even get here? How did a courtroom, a place known for restraint and order, transform into a stage where truth and brilliance stood toe-to-toe against arrogance and dismissal? To understand that, we have to rewind to the moments when the odds seemed stacked, when an underestimated voice was expected to fade into the background, and when power believed it could not be challenged. On one side stood arrogance, sharp suits, smug certainty. The old guard that believed intimidation was enough to silence. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, not with volume, but with clarity, not with privilege, but with precision. Every eye in that chamber sensed the imbalance, sensed the weight pressing against her. And yet, what no one knew in those first tense seconds was that she had come prepared not just to argue, but to transform the entire room. The stakes were higher than a single ruling. It was about respect versus dismissal, intellect versus ego, dignity versus disdain. And when the judge finally leaned forward, when his words sliced through the tension, the nation watching would realize something seismic had just shifted. What came before that thunderous applause? The story, as you're about to see, changes everything. The case itself was never just about dry statutes or obscure legal codes. From the very beginning, it carried the weight of symbolism, an unspoken battle over who gets to define truth in America. National cameras had already zeroed in. Pundits lined up outside the courthouse, and social feeds hummed with speculation. Everyone knew this wasn't just another hearing. This was a proving ground, a clash of values, a test of who gets heard and who gets dismissed. Inside the chamber, the air vibrated with that knowledge. Every shuffle of paper, every whisper between clerks felt amplified by the awareness that millions were waiting for updates. For some, this was political theater. For others, it was deeply personal, a mirror reflecting their own struggles for dignity and recognition. And then she walked in, Jasmine Crockett. To the untrained eye, her entrance might have seemed ordinary, almost subdued. No entourage trailed behind her, no theatrics announced her arrival. But the subtle underestimation was immediate. You could see it in the raised eyebrows of seasoned lawyers, in the faint smirks of those convinced they already knew how this would end. To them, she was just another name on the docket, another lawyer destined to be drowned out by louder, older voices. But under the surface, Crockett carried a presence that no dismissive glance could erase. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, honed from years of battling through spaces where people like her were told they didn't belong. Every step toward her seat was deliberate, calm, and measured, as though she knew something the room did not. Above it all loomed Judge Amul Thapar. His reputation preceded him, firm, unflinching, respected across divides. His very posture radiated authority, the kind that could silence a room with the flick of an eyebrow. And yet, as he studied the scene before him, a subtle tension lingered. He too understood that this hearing carried weight far beyond the case file. The decision wouldn't just interpret law, it would echo into the culture. The early exchanges played out like a familiar script, the antagonist puffing up their arguments, dismissing Crockett with the casual arrogance of someone convinced of victory. Every word dripped with the assumption that she was outmatched, that her voice would never rise above their own. But appearances can be deceiving. Crockett sat poised, her notes crisp, her eyes sharp, not rattled, not defensive, but calculating. She waited, letting the waves of arrogance crash, letting the smugness build to its inevitable peak. And then, as the room settled into its rhythm of imbalance, something shifted. A pause, a breath, and the faintest flicker of anticipation in her expression. It was as if she held in her hand a matchstick, ready to ignite the air itself. What she said next would flip the power dynamic on its head. Long before this hearing, the antagonist had cultivated a reputation that thrived on fear. Colleagues whispered about his presence in courtrooms across the country, the cutting remarks that left witnesses trembling, the theatrical cross-examinations designed not to reveal truth, but to humiliate, the way he carried himself as if the law itself bent at his command. To some, he was a master of strategy. To others, he was a bully, cloaked in legal jargon. His rise had been swift, propelled not by empathy or fairness, but by an unwavering belief that dominance equaled respect. In every case, he sought not just to win, but to leave his opponent diminished. He interrupted mercilessly, sneered at hesitation, and wielded complex language like a sword meant to confuse rather than clarify. The old guard applauded him for it. To them, he was proof that the system worked in favor of those who knew how to weaponize it. Behind closed doors, the stories multiplied. A young attorney once walked out of his courtroom in tears after being mocked for stumbling on a word. Another, fresh from law school, described feeling like prey under the weight of his relentless sarcasm. He called it toughening the field. Others called it intimidation dressed as professionalism. And the truth was, he loved the performance of it all. The courtroom wasn't just a place of justice, it was his stage, and he reveled in the applause of those who mistook cruelty for brilliance. Over the years, his arrogance hardened into certainty. Every victory reinforced his belief that no one could challenge him, that the balance of power would always tip his way. When Jasmine Crockett's name first appeared on the docket, he hardly gave it a second thought. To him, she was just another opponent to be dismantled, another chance to showcase his supposed superiority. He smirked at her youth, at her composure, mistaking calm for weakness. But the deeper contrast was undeniable. He embodied the old guard, privileged, insulated, thriving in an environment that rewarded intimidation over intellect. Jasmine Crockett, by comparison, represented something far more dangerous to him: change. She carried the quiet power of preparation, the sharp edge of lived experience, and the humility to let her arguments, not her ego, speak for her. Where he demanded respect through fear, she inspired it through clarity. The collision of those two forces was inevitable. Every word he threw at her dripped with condescension, as if daring her to stumble. Every gesture radiated entitlement, as if he were untouchable. But what he failed to see was the shift happening around him. The audience was no longer mesmerized by bluster. They were leaning in, waiting for substance. And while arrogance can intimidate for a season, it always plants the seeds of its own downfall. Because arrogance always carries one fatal flaw. Before the applause, before the cameras, before her name carried weight in political and legal circles, Jasmine Crockett's story began in places where power was rarely handed out, and respect was never guaranteed. She wasn't born into privilege, nor did she inherit connections that smoothed her path. What she carried instead was grit, the kind forged in the quiet battles of everyday life. Nights spent studying when exhaustion clawed at her, mornings when doubt whispered that she didn't belong, moments when silence would have been easier than speaking up. From her earliest days, Jasmine knew the sting of being underestimated. Teachers who looked past her hand in the classroom, classmates who scoffed at her ambitions. Later, colleagues who assumed she was filling a quota rather than leading with her own merit. Each dismissal left its mark, but instead of shrinking, she used those moments as fuel. Every condescending look became a reason to push harder, every closed door a reason to find another way in. Law was never just a career for her, it was a calling. She saw in it both the cruelty of systems designed to exclude and the potential of a tool sharp enough to carve out justice. To pursue it meant sacrifice. Friends drifted away while she poured herself into study. Family gatherings were often cut short so she could prepare for exams or research cases. She carried the weight of expectations larger than herself, the silent hopes of those who had never been allowed in those rooms, who longed to see someone who looked like them stand before the bench with authority. Mentorships shaped her too. There were senior attorneys, few but powerful in their influence, who recognized her fire and stoked it with wisdom. They reminded her that composure was not weakness, that precision could pierce louder than shouting, that the most dangerous lawyer in any room was the one who didn't need to prove she belonged. These lessons became her armor, lessons she carried into every courtroom. And resilience became her trademark. Judges who once doubted her learned quickly that she came prepared with more than arguments. She came with receipts, precedent, logic sharpened to a fine point. When opponents tried to rattle her with interruptions, she didn't flinch. When they belittled her, she met them with calm persistence, forcing respect through undeniable skill. Slowly, case by case, she built a reputation not as someone who was handed anything, but as someone who had earned every inch. But beyond her own journey, Jasmine Crockett carried voices larger than her own. Every time she stood to speak, she brought with her the dignity of those whose struggles were often ignored, the immigrants working 2 jobs just to make rent, the women of color told to lower their voices, the families navigating systems that seemed built to break them. She knew the weight of representation, the responsibility of being more than one person's story, and rather than shy away from it, she embraced it, transforming that responsibility into power. By the time she walked into that courtroom under the gaze of Judge Thapar, she wasn't just a lawyer defending a case. She was the culmination of years of discipline, sacrifice, and resilience. A living reminder that brilliance can emerge from struggle, and that calm resolve can be more formidable than arrogance. The old guard might not have recognized it yet, but the tides of history rarely ask permission before they shift. And when the moment came, all those years of grit sharpened into one unstoppable blade of truth. The opening volleys of the courtroom duel sounded almost routine until you paid attention to the tone. The antagonist leaned into his trademark style, his words dripping with dismissal, every sentence framed as if he were doing the court a favor by even responding. He gestured broadly, striding across the space like an actor who believed the spotlight belonged to him alone. His voice rose and fell theatrically, not for clarity, but for intimidation. And with every pause, he glanced toward Jasmine Crockett, as if daring her to stumble, as if her presence were an inconvenience he could swat aside with sarcasm. "Counselor," he said with an exaggerated sigh, "perhaps you've overlooked the most basic principle at play here." His interruption cut across her attempt to lay out her argument, the kind of tactic he had used countless times to throw others off balance. In the old days, it might have worked. But Crockett did not bite. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match arrogance with outrage. Instead, she let the silence sit for a beat, long enough for the room to feel the weight of his interruption. Then she resumed, her voice steady, every word precise. Like stones, carefully laid to build an unshakable foundation. The contrast was striking. Where he was bluster, she was focus. Where he aimed for volume, she delivered clarity. Each time he cut in with another dismissive remark, she returned with calm persistence, citing precedent, weaving logic, and stitching together a narrative that the spectators could follow with ease. Slowly, the imbalance of power began to shift. The murmurs from the gallery were telling, law clerks exchanging glances, reporters scribbling faster, even the jury of public opinion in the audience, sensing that the scales were tilting. Every time Crockett spoke, she added weight to her side of the argument. Every time he postured, he seemed lighter, less substantial, more desperate. The antagonist, sensing his grip slipping, doubled down. He raised his voice further, spoke over her more aggressively, as if sheer force could reclaim control. But the louder he grew, the smaller he appeared, and the quieter she remained, the stronger her words landed. By the midpoint of their exchange, the energy in the room had shifted so palpably, it was almost physical. It no longer felt like a duel between equals. It felt like inevitability unfolding, the gradual collapse of arrogance under the weight of composure. Crockett's presence expanded with every rebuttal, her credibility stacking like bricks in a fortress. And then came the pause. She finished a line of argument so seamless, so undeniable, that even the antagonist found himself momentarily at a loss. The courtroom stilled, every gaze flicking toward the bench, waiting for the judge to weigh in. And then, the unthinkable. The judge leans forward. The room froze as Judge Thapar leaned forward, his gaze settling on Jasmine Crockett. The silence was thick, charged, as if the entire chamber were holding its breath. Crockett adjusted her papers, not with haste, not with nerves, but with the deliberate calm of someone about to shift the ground beneath everyone's feet. Her voice broke the silence, low, but unwavering. Your Honor, with respect, the opposing counsel has made 3 assertions. Each sounds compelling on the surface, but each collapses under the simplest scrutiny. She paused, letting the words hang just long enough for heads to turn. Already the tension crackled. She began with the first point, methodically untangling the antagonist's claim. With every citation she laid down, with every precedent she invoked, his bluster seemed less like mastery and more like smoke. She moved step by step, careful and exact, exposing flaws so glaring that the audience couldn't help but murmur. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. One clerk scribbled notes furiously. Another shook their head in disbelief at how thoroughly she had punctured his opening salvo. The antagonist shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He tried to interject, but Judge Thapar raised a hand, an unspoken command for silence. Crockett continued, her eyes steady, her tone unshaken. Now, as to the second claim, she traced it back to its foundation and dismantled it piece by piece, not with aggression, but with precision. Each time she paused, the courtroom seemed to lean closer, as though unwilling to miss a single word. The antagonist's face flushed. He shuffled his papers, then leaned back with exaggerated impatience. But the cracks were showing. His pen tapped nervously. His once booming confidence had shrunk into a brittle defense, visible to everyone watching. Crockett pressed on, and finally, the third assertion. Here, she delivered the masterstroke, with a single reference, a ruling buried in the case law that few would have thought to unearth. She exposed not just a flaw in his reasoning, but a contradiction so bold it reversed the meaning of his own argument. Gasps erupted across the room. Someone in the gallery covered their mouth. The sound of whispers surged, rising into a wave of disbelief. She let the noise wash over her, standing in the center of it like a calm in the storm. Then she delivered the line that cut deepest. When we rely on arrogance instead of evidence, we do not practice law. We perform theater. And this courtroom is not a stage for ego. It is a place for truth. The antagonist's composure shattered. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a clenched jaw, his eyes darting as if searching for a foothold. The courtroom saw it. The fall of a man who had once built his reputation on intimidation, now unraveling under the steady weight of clarity. It was then that Judge Thapar spoke, not to interrupt, but to amplify. His voice carried authority, but beneath it was something rarer, admiration. Miss Crockett, your reasoning is as precise as it is compelling. The court recognizes the clarity you've brought to this case. The gallery erupted. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then unstoppable, filling the chamber in a way few had ever witnessed in such solemn halls. The sound was not just for a legal victory. It was for the dignity, the brilliance, the composure that had silenced arrogance and elevated truth. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, and even those who had doubted her when she first walked in found themselves swept up in the force of the moment. The antagonist slumped, his shoulders heavy, his air of invincibility dissolved. Jasmine Crockett, however, remained composed, as if applause were not her pursuit, but a byproduct of something greater, the relentless pursuit of justice. She gathered her papers slowly, her calmness only deepening the respect swelling around her. And yet, as the echoes of applause faded and the gavel struck to restore order, the story was far from over. Because what happened inside that courtroom would not stay within those four walls. It was only the beginning of a ripple effect that would stretch far beyond the day's proceedings. But the story didn't end when the gavel struck. The applause in the courtroom had barely faded before the outside world caught fire. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of the antagonist spread across social media like sparks leaping from dry timber. The moment Judge Thapar praised her brilliance became a looped highlight, replayed endlessly on timelines and feeds. Hashtags surged into the trending lists, #Crockett Crush, #Truth in the Courtroom, #Respect Earned. By the end of the day, millions had watched the exchange, their reactions flooding comment sections with words like powerful, inspiring, and historic. Memes blossomed almost instantly. Screenshots of the antagonist's face at the precise moment his confidence cracked were paired with captions like, "When receipts hit harder than arrogance," or, "This is what composure looks like." Others compared Crockett's calm dismantling to a surgeon's precision, a blade of truth slicing through ego. What had been a tense courtroom duel transformed into viral entertainment, a cultural flashpoint wrapped in equal parts humor and admiration. But it wasn't just ordinary users who amplified the story. Legal commentators flooded television panels, dissecting every move. On one network, a former federal prosecutor marveled, "I haven't seen an argument dismantled that cleanly in years." A constitutional scholar tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett's performance was not just persuasive, it was textbook brilliance." Even journalists who prided themselves on neutrality couldn't resist framing the moment as a symbolic victory for dignity over disdain. Celebrities joined the chorus. An Oscar-winning actress shared the clip with the caption, "This is how you own a room, with intelligence, not arrogance." A well-known musician posted, "Watching Jasmine Crockett reminded me of my mother. Quiet strength, unshakable dignity, respect." Each endorsement expanded her reach, transforming a courtroom exchange into a nationwide conversation about resilience and representation. Meanwhile, the antagonist found himself at the center of mockery. Where once his bluster commanded deference, it now fueled satire. Late-night hosts replayed his interruptions, contrasting them with Crockett's calm replies, drawing laughter from audiences who once feared his type of arrogance. Opinion pieces called him a relic of an outdated style of intimidation, someone who mistook noise for strength and ego for authority. His reputation, once burnished by fear, now looked brittle under the glare of public scrutiny. Through it all, Crockett's image rose, not as a one-time victor, but as a symbol. For many, she represented the possibility of being heard in spaces designed to exclude. She embodied the belief that intellect could defeat arrogance, that composure could outlast aggression, and that dignity itself could be a form of power. Her performance was no longer just about one case. It was about a cultural yearning for a different kind of leadership in law and politics. The wave of praise wasn't just admiration, it was identification. Viewers who had long felt overlooked saw themselves in her calm defiance. Immigrants, women, young lawyers, and ordinary citizens all claimed a piece of her victory as their own. Yet, beyond the noise online, something deeper had shifted in America's legal conscience. In the days that followed, the echoes of Judge Thapar's words continued to reverberate far beyond the courtroom walls. His validation of Jasmine Crockett was not just procedural acknowledgement, it was a cultural moment, a rare fracture in the image of a system that too often rewards arrogance over intellect. When he leaned forward and praised her reasoning, he validated not only a lawyer, but a truth that had long been waiting for recognition. Brilliance deserves reverence, no matter who embodies it. For generations, the balance of power in legal spaces tilted toward those who projected dominance. It was assumed that intimidation meant strength, that loudness equaled authority. Yet here was a different lesson, made undeniable by Crockett's calm composure. Intellect had triumphed over arrogance. Dignity had outlasted dismissal. Perseverance had proven stronger than privilege. Her victory reframed the courtroom not as a place where the loudest prevailed, but as a stage where clarity, preparation, and truth could shine. For those who had grown tired of watching ego masquerade as brilliance, the moment felt like vindication. For those who had doubted their own place in professional or academic spaces, it felt like a signal flare. You belong, and your preparation can cut through noise. What made this moment resonate was not simply the law. It was the humanity inside it. Crockett's journey from underestimation to validation mirrored the struggles of countless people whose intelligence is questioned, whose voices are silenced, whose dignity is dismissed before they ever speak. Her triumph wasn't abstract. It was lived proof that perseverance finds its reward, that truth eventually forces its way into the open. And Judge Thapar's words mattered too. Coming from the bench, they carried authority, but more importantly, they carried hope. In that instant, he became not merely an arbiter of law, but a witness to history, acknowledging that brilliance is undeniable when it rises, even in the face of arrogance. The moral was clear, and it spread far beyond one case. Justice is not only about rulings and verdicts, it is about the courage to speak truth, the discipline to prepare, and the dignity to stand firm when underestimated. Truth may take time, but it always finds a voice. And so, the lesson lingered. This wasn't just about law, it was about us. It was about every overlooked student, every silenced immigrant, every dismissed worker, every underestimated fighter who knows what it feels like to be doubted. Crockett's moment became theirs, a reminder that history bends not to arrogance, but to perseverance. The applause may have faded, but the resonance of that truth had only just begun. What began as another courtroom clash ended as something unforgettable. Judge Amul Thapar venerating Jasmine Crockett's brilliance, a packed chamber breaking into applause, and a nation reminded that dignity always outshines arrogance. The title of this story wasn't exaggeration. It was a reflection of a moment so powerful it could not be contained within four walls. We saw what happens when intellect stands its ground, when composure refuses to bend before dismissal, when perseverance cuts through privilege. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of everyone who watched. This is the lesson we take with us. Justice may be delayed, truth may be doubted, dignity may be underestimated, but when it finally breaks through, it transforms everything. Jasmine Crockett's brilliance is more than a personal triumph. It is a reminder that each of us carries the capacity to challenge arrogance with clarity and win. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of your own worth and struggle, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of the movement where dignity always wins. Because when the gavel falls, history listens.